Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and welcome to our second panel. We had an amazing panel looking at MSU's impact on the African continent history, and as we are celebrating the 65-year anniversary of the African Studies Center. Today, we have another power-packed panel, combining current faculty, alumni. We even have, we have an alumni and a emerita faculty here. So I will let Dr. Dr. Wiley introduce the panel. But what we are looking at today, and being Black History Month as well, so the themes for this month were really tied to these intersectionalities between MSU and the impact that MSU have had on the African continent. Today, focus on the liberation struggles and the shared struggles of the broader African diasporas and the role that MSU has played in that. Going all the way back in terms of human rights and contributions there, looking at Pan-African solidarities, another area of importance as well. And then also important leadership role that African Studies and specifically Dr. Wiley here played in establishing the Association of Concerned Africa Scholars that started out of here, leadership and across the US and globally. So also mobilizing help to end apartheid, and we're gonna hear more about that, including the divestment plan here. And then I remember recently visiting the Nelson Mandela Museum. There is a plaque there from the state of Michigan. There's this pride, and I imagine that that MSU was involved in that as well, in facilitating that approach. And then also, so the panelists then are looking at our African studies, looking at these political influences, and then how the MSU helped to amplify voices of the marginalized, especially in Africa. But at the same time, as we are celebrating this legacy of impact and advocacy, we also looking today to inspire commitment and equity as we look forward, and solidarity as we look forward in our shared global future. So without further ado, I'll introduce Professor David Wiley, our former Director of African Studies, who is the moderator for this panel and played a central role in pulling together the panelists, to introduce the panel and to take us through. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Leo. Well, this is a difficult topic to squeeze into 90 minutes, and so we're not going to keep you here till 6 p.m. We're going to try to stay within the limits here with the 5 of us who are available. And so I want to say just a word about the context in which all this occurs, because how does one date African studies in MSU's African Studies? Because there were a few Africanists at MSU in the 1950s, but the center really takes off after the Soviets put up their Sputnik in 1957. And the next year, 12 months later, the Congress passes the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which said for U.S. security reasons in the Cold War, we need area studies centers teaching languages and history and knowledge of all of the countries of the world. And all this, of course, was accentuated by the fact of the foundation of the United Nations, and with the coming in 1960, which really marks the nadir of African studies in the U.S. With the development of the Title VI centers, and MSU becomes one of the founding Title VI centers under the NDEA Act then. So at the same time that there was this good news, within 1960, 17 new African nations really accentuating our interest in Africa. Then the wave of Peace Corps folks going to and coming from Africa and in other volunteer programs. We were also at the height of the Cold War, and MSU, in fact, was part of the Cold War Vietnam project. This famous article on ramparts of the University on the Mek really was helped to set much of MSU's national reputation. I remember going to an SSRC conference in New York, and on the elevator, and one of the people there says to me in the elevator, "Oh, you're from that university." This was that university with what was said to be the largest U.S. aid project ever of technical assistance to Vietnam, and MSU was at the height of that. Of course, was all the period of explosion of globalization of U.S. corporations, with more than 300 in South Africa alone, which really said where the U.S. commercial and foreign policy interests was centered in Africa. But it was a period of activism and the growth of activism at MSU, with a local chapter of the Students for Democratic Society, which was second in size in the nation, only to Harvard, which was larger, with a national SDS convention held at MSU Union in 1968, where it was said there were 300 undercover agents from federal security agencies spying on the 500 authentic delegates there at the Union. Then with the invasion of Cambodia, MSU had the largest campus strike in history, with 12,000 students boycotting classes for more than 2 weeks. Along with this process, of course, was the growth of security locally, with the East Lansing Police, MSU Department of Public Safety, and the state police all cooperating in building the Red Squad 38,000 files on MSU faculty and students, documenting who was protesting against DoD contractors and MSU activities. At the same time, the U.S. became aware that the U.S. That Michigan State had built a new program at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, which set a different tone, and along with the Peace Corps returnees, started to create a constant flow of Americans who had experienced the hospitality, the welcome, the generosity of their African partners in Nigeria. At that time as well, however, South Africa, seen with the globalization and the Michigan corporations that were in South Africa, really mounted their campaign to convert Michiganians to the South African cause, with free trips for Michigan House and Senate members, information packets to state officials, lobbying visits by prominent South Africans and embassy personnel, and to hundreds of teachers in Michigan schools, information packets on the viability of the South African economy and so on. And there also were its agents, such as Professor Weaver in the criminal justice, who actually proposed that there be a study abroad program from MSU to South Africa, where he proposed to take the white students into South Africa and the African-American students in the group to Botswana, and then say they could then compare their experiences afterwards and would all be enriched by this diversity of experience. The center objected to this plan, and the program actually never took off. And there was also the MSU's John McGough, a publisher of Michigan that we'll talk about later. With that Cold War, well, here on campus, we became aware, that the CIA was very active across Africa, supporting Jonas Savimbi in Angola, Siad Barre in Somalia, Nimeri in Sudan, attempted assassination of President Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the elected president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and support of dictator General Mobutu as well. So the Cold War loomed large in the sensibilities of people returning from Africa and who became aware of the extent of U.S. CIA activities there. So with that, let's turn to our panelists, and I'm going to introduce all of our panelists. We're going to start with Professor Bill Derman, Professor Emeritus of the MSU Department of Anthropology, and also in Norway of the Department of International Environment and Development Studies. Bill was one of the founding members, I'll show you a picture in a moment, of the Southern Africa Liberation Committee at MSU, a student and faculty organization, which really mounted the divestment campaign here. Bill will be followed by Liz Harrow, who's a local architect who was a student in urban planning at the time of the Southern Africa Liberation Committee's campaign to get McGough off of the Wharton Center. Liz was active with SALC then, and also has been for many, many years a faithful founder of the local chapter of Amnesty International, seeking to help African refugees and other scholars internationally who are imprisoned by their governments without trial. Liz will be followed by Denise Troutman, who's an associate professor in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and Cultures at MSU, as well as in linguistics, languages, and cultures. She's going to tell us about the good things that MSU was active on after the end of apartheid, with 2 U.S. Senior Fulbright Scholar Awards as a winner of a postdoctoral fellowship from the American Association of the University of Women. Professor Troutman has had extremely active programs introducing students to South Africa at MSU and to others across the university. She was also president of the Black Faculty Staff and Administrators Association, and currently is working on a new book on politeness and impoliteness in African American speech community. I will follow them with a final portrayal as well. So with that, let me welcome our good friend and faithful longtime anthropologist in the African Studies Center, Professor Bill Derman.
Oh, afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. I'm sorry I could not be there in person. I should be back in East Lansing for a while during the month of March, and would love to join you then. So I will just talk. I will go back to the 1970s and 1980s, in those wondrous years before PowerPoint and social media. And if you check the Africanist Archive, you'll even find photocopies of mimeographed documents that we circulated to educate people. I have benefited over the years from USAID and have had substantial research support on the Gambia River Basin and land and water in Zimbabwe. So in my activist mode, I would think it would be good for the African Studies Center and Michigan State University to strongly protest the shredding of USAID, if not its elimination. My former colleagues in agricultural economics have lived on the research and programmatic money of USAID throughout the continent, which has supported their wonderful work. And that, of course, raises the immediate academic question about when to engage and when not to. And I might, signal first they came for the transgender people, and then who's next? And so I do think that these are times of peril. The talk is a personal one and does not represent the wide range of activities the African Studies Center and Michigan State have carried out in Africa, nor the support of students who wanted to carry out research in Africa or have a year abroad in Africa. The work that has gone into maintaining the Title VI funding, the African Leadership Group that has promoted and defended African studies throughout the university, and I could say fairly successfully. So I'm proud of the center's history. And when I was acting director of the African Studies Center, I had a role in trying to actualize my support One of the more brilliant things we did was to bring John Metzler to the center to bring Africa to the schools of Michigan and beyond. So speaking about activism in the 1960s through 80s brings back many memories and the realization of the loss of details over the years. My own knowledge of events and processes at Michigan State as a participant in the research on the Gambia River Basin took me out of Michigan State for 2 years. My work with the Toronto Committee on Southern Africa took me out of Michigan State for another couple of years. And then, which I find complicates my own emotions and responses, I came to do politically oriented field research on resettlement and land reform in Zimbabwe, migrants from Zimbabwe to South Africa, especially in 2008, and land restitution in South Africa. In short, I got a very close and critical look at some issues that arose for the liberation movements in their transition to being governing parties. And then to see the outcome of the movements that I supported as an activist. I came to Michigan State in the fall of 1968 via the University of Michigan and the fieldwork in the Republic of Guinea. I was hired by 2 Arctic anthropologists, one of whom was the director of the African Studies Center. And I came to Michigan State because of the African Studies Center. 1968, as David has begun to enumerate, was a year of left political activism along with the activism of the right in the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and the police riots in Chicago. The Vietnam War was expanding, and Nixon was elected on the basis of a secret peace plan. As part of a culture of rebellion, the African Studies Association annual meetings in Montreal were disrupted by African American and African students and scholars. They were protesting the lack of African and African American significance in the association. At the same time, an event that didn't get much coverage, a sit-in was organized at the African Studies Center with a similar theme of protest. I was in Montreal, so I'm unsure, but I think they were organized by 2 Kenyan students and 1 African American student. Peter Kamuyu was then a student in anthropology, and Maina Wakinyari was a Kenyan historian who later became renowned, or differently. He was imprisoned for 6 years, mostly in solitary confinement by Daniel Arap Moi, president of Kenya, and he came to the US seeking political asylum. At around this time, the African Studies Center had organized an interdisciplinary course on Africa, which met once a week. It was meant to introduce students to the range of disciplines that studied Africa. However, after the sit-in, the core faculty was called to a meeting to discuss and debate whether or not to have a police presence at the course. David made mention of Vietnam Project. It was headed by Wesley Fischel, and his time around the campus when the Ramparts article appeared, he was accompanied by police most of the time. Such a discussion created a tense and politicized environment, which led to the resignation of the director. I would love to see minutes from those meetings. 1970 saw the bombing and attack on Cambodia and a strike by Michigan State University students and faculty. Peace talks dragged on, but the war rapidly coming to an end. The anti-war group that I helped form, and so I disagree with David's stopping of activism around the war in 1970, because many people from Michigan State went to Washington in 1972 to close down the government. The group was named Crisis in America, which was ironic and a play on CIA. And we held a conference in 1972 to plan for what we should do next. And then the idea for a Southern Africa Liberation Committee came out of the Empire New Clothes meetings. Bud Day, a minister with the United Ministries of Higher Education, chair of the Peace Committee, and Carol Thompson, a PhD student in political science, and lastly, Lovemore Nyoni, a social work student from the then Rhodesia. And I was part of that foursome. And we were faced initially of meeting the requirements for a student organization. We did not see a freestanding group, but rather a student organization which would then have access to some resources and legitimacy. In 1972, there wasn't much Southern African expertise at Michigan State. As a new organization, we emphasized initially on, not surprisingly, education. We held meetings and discussions about the colonial wars being conducted by the military, Portuguese military, supported by US and NATO weapons. We recognized that the wars were getting little academic or media coverage. We also focused on the growing war in Rhodesia to reflect Lovemore Nyoni's national interest. We emphasized pamphlets and education. If you check out the Africanist archive, you can find much materials from that time period, although it doesn't indicate the kind of the richness of the meetings. In 1975, Last Grave at Dimbaza, a relatively well-known film on the inequalities in South Africa, was available. Luta Continua was available from Bob van Lierop, documenting the Mozambican struggles against Portuguese colonial rule. The visual presentation of those issues were really quite extraordinary and were very effective for building a movement. After I received tenure and promotion, I became eligible for sabbatical. And that time, while as an activist, I had only done research in West Africa. I became aware of the Canadian group when we invited John Saul to speak on Tanzanian peasantries. He invited me to come to Toronto and join the Toronto Committee for the Liberation of Southern Africa. And there was always that silent C, which was the liberation of Canada. And I don't think they meant to have Trump as their president. I spent almost 2 years there, and it was very different because it wasn't just about activism, but it was also the intellectual engagement on the nature of the political economies of the region. And that was supported by a whole group of radical scholars who had served together at the University of Dar es Salaam. And politically, Canada was more relaxed than the anti-communism of the US. With Mozambican and Angolan independence in 1975, I was in Toronto at a meeting of Tickelsack when John Saul returned from his invitation to the independence celebrations in Mozambique, glowing with confidence for its future when he returned. And he returned to actually teach at a university in Mozambique. Boy, are we disappointed. And then we continued emphasis on Angola because of the Civil War and the CIA support for one faction of the three liberation movements. I returned to Michigan State in the fall of 1976 to find Bud and Carol leaving and needing a reconstruction of Salk. Of course, with a changing student body, that always happens. Michael Bratton arrived, David Wiley arrived, Mary Lee Wiley arrived, Chris Root arrived. There was just a whole new generation of Southern Africa focus. And so with Zimbabwe independence in 1980, Salk became focused on South Africa. And this is something that Dave will talk much more about because of his work and Chris Root's work on divestment on networking with African American churches with the events and policies in South Africa. And we
Bill,
should,
we're nearing the end of our time period here.
okay. I would just like to say, were you going to describe the McGough campaign?
A little bit, yeah. You probably, will you describe the McGough campaign?
Yes, I will. I'll say it very briefly.
Okay, then I will just point to the activism of students who, learning about the policy of forcing South Africans into the homelands, and the housing crisis that produced, they put up a shanty town in front of the administration building. And the first night that it was up, it was destroyed by right-wing activist students who seemed to be inebriated. And then some faculty and others came out to support them. The police intervened, and the shanty town was able to stay up for quite a long time. I will stop there. Obviously, in thinking about what the revolution was, what's happened to it, what happens to liberation movements and power, there are many lessons to be learned, critiques to be launched, along with much sympathy for what has been attempted. And that would be, I think, the subject of another panel. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Now we'll turn to Liz Harrow, who is our Amnesty International
He
representative.
said Denise is after me. Okay, great. This last time he said that. Yeah, go ahead.
She goes, sorry, Denise, is she online?
She's online, yes.
Okay, I didn't know.
Okay, so I'm perfectly willing to go now. My talk is going to be very short because I'm not an academic. And that's actually what I was then. I was a student. I was a foot soldier in this South African Liberation Committee activities. I had a boyfriend who was attending these things or interested in this, and he had been more active in the Vietnam protests than I had been. And I was and I followed. I want to just take a little side thing. Nowadays, I'm an older woman. I'm on a test, an exercise lab, where medical students watch me and a bunch of other old women on treadmills. And the women we've become chatty with each other when inevitably we're talking about politics now. And whenever we talk about politics, the kids near us, the medical students near us go, oh yeah, I don't know anything about that. And I want to hit them, I just really I really am angry with them. And I think I must have been that same kid, right? And so it might be worse. It might be worse today because we're more informed, and so we're less informed because we have so much to look at that we don't look at the same things as we used to. Maybe it was all students were united around the Vietnam War and then around issues like South Africa. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just the kids that I knew. But I think that if you want to have, I think that what I learned from the activities of SOC and from the campaigns that we did is a little bit how to run an activity. And the way that they did this so successfully here at MSU is they made it super, super local. We focused on MSU divesting. We were not writing letters to presidents. We were not writing letters to senators. We were going to our board of trustees and asking them to divest from South Africa. We would have protests where we would take Coke cans out on the sidewalk and we would stamp on them. And my son, who was 2 or something like that, they got a really good picture of this little kid. He just thought he was crushing Coke cans. It was, it was great photo opportunity. I guess maybe now, again, maybe we have too many of those photos, and so they don't have the same resonance. We met frequently, and students like to meet at night. So we met at 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night. That was a clever thing. And we had this couple, Pat and Frank, what was Pat and Frank's last name? Beeman, that's right, who were not academics, but were dedicated, who had filled their house up with posters and with materials and stickers and things. And they gave us tasks. There were other people as well. There was Mary Lee Wiley also was there. But we were children, and we were told, we were directed a bit, and we did not, we had opinions, but we did not have the carry through that those other people who organized the organization did. One big issue that we did was McGough off. It was a super local issue, which was that there was an amphitheater at the university and the Wharton Center that was going to be named for the wife, I think, of a big South African supporter, this publisher, McGough, who wanted to name this for his wife. It was named, and so every time there was a performance at the McGough Theater, we showed up. It was really a very thin connection, but it was super local, and we were there with our posters. Most of us were very polite. There was one woman who was not. And it was something that we did, I would say, at least once a month, but I think maybe once a week. We were doing some kind of small event, and I had the time and the energy without actually understanding all of the points that that Bill was just making. The other thing, though, is that during this time and now, we were afraid it was possible to be punished. I knew students who became completely paranoid. I knew students during the Vietnam protests, and I came to MSU in 1970, so I was a bit young in the beginning of that, they were sure that FBI people were tracking them. They were sure that they may have just been going through a psychotic break, but they may actually have been tracked, right? Mm-hmm. We knew we could get punished. We knew of kids who lost their scholarships. And now we're in that very same time, right? We're in that time now where he just said that he's going to get all those jihadists and kick them out of the university. And University of Michigan has taken has made it so that some students can't be on campus because they participated in the anti-Gaza protests. And I think we're more afraid now. My impression is that people are a little bit less willing to stand up the way we did then, I think that the risk was as great then. I think there were a lot of kids who went to jail or who lost scholarships. And I think that we have to figure out some way to carry that same kind of organizing that we did then forward. And the battles will not necessarily be with South Africa, but we have to figure out a way. And again, for me, that means somebody's at the center, and we get a lot of disciples who are a little bit like those medical students in my room that don't necessarily know, but are willing, are good-hearted. Because right now what we do is we send out an email and people click and they think that they've done something. And that's not going to do it. We have to do more. And I think we have to put some bodies in front of a building. We have to find an issue that's local and protest. That's all. That's what I got. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. So let's turn to Denise now. Denise is going to be talking about the activism of MSU and its faculty in South Africa after the struggle had ended. And in 1994, we finally have Nelson Mandela as president there. Denise?
You're muted still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this does correctly.
It's there. It's good.
Okay, give me just a minute. Too many things are in the way. Let me minimize this. So here we go. You already know this part. I am going to approach it from a different perspective. So I do want to say that it is indeed my honor and pleasure to participate in this panel and in the 65th anniversary focused on a legacy of progress, a future of promise. I am going to follow suit with a quote that has come from Professor Zulu. With a deep history of engagement, and this is for the African Studies Center, with a deep history of engagement across the African continent, the center has fostered a dynamic academic community committed to advancing research, teaching, and outreach. And so mine is definitely focused on that idea of teaching. And I want to situate my presentation this way. I graduated from a historically Black university, Bethune-Cookman University, located in Daytona Beach, Florida. Time does not allow me to expose the depth of HBCUs, the acronym, the struggles, the obstacles, the brilliance, the resistance, the resilience, the grit, the vision, the wisdom, and the accomplishments in apartheid South Africa. This is Black History Month, and I'm glad that Professor Zulu highlighted that. So let me share just a few words about the distinguished, extraordinary, inimitable founder of Bethune-Cookman University, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. She was the 15th of 17 children. Born July 10th, 1875, 10 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. She was born to formerly enslaved parents. Jim Crowism and anti-Blackness reigned throughout the South, including South Carolina, where Dr. Bethune was raised on her parents' small farm. Though most of her siblings were born as slaves, Dr. Bethune was born free in the midst of rice and cotton fields. Due to her grandmother's and her mother's influence, Dr. Bethune developed an unwavering faith in God, which persisted throughout her 80 years of life. For many humans, being born under harsh conditions of social and economic disenfranchisement, the nadir of American race relations, lynchings, Black codes, slavery by another name, convict leasing, and anti-Blackness, that would induce for many hopelessness, despair, self-hatred. Not so for Dr. Bethune. She unequivocally exhibited faith, hope, love, a respectful use of power, vision, dedication, and perseverance on the behalf of others. Dr. Bethune fully enacted love for her community. Her investment in social upliftment is enshrined historically in her founding of a boarding school for girls, and you can see them pictured here. The Daytona Beach Literary and Industrial School for Training Negro Girls. She started it in October 3rd, 1904 with 5 girls on a trash dump with $1.50. Dr. Bethune recounted, I had no furniture. I begged dry goods boxes and made benches and stools, begged a basin and other things like that. And in 1904, 5 little girls here started the school. Dr. Bethune is acknowledged as the first lady of the struggle. She unwaveringly committed to bettering the lives of African Americans. Despite the crippling circumstances of racism and white supremacy, she emerged as a prodigious leader, university president, community organizer, and advisor to President of the United States at that time, President Franklin Roosevelt, and the only female member of the president's quote unquote Black cabinet. Honored with many awards, Bethune's life was celebrated with a memorial statue, if you don't know this, in Washington, D.C. And on July 13, 2022, Dr. Bethune became the first African-American to be represented with a state statue in the National Statuary Hall collection in the U.S. Capitol. So if you visit there, you'll be able to see it. Attending and graduating from an HBCU engendered many ideological and philosophical principles into my praxis, including tenets from Dr. Bethune's last will and testament, intended, in her words, for Negroes everywhere, in the hope that an old woman's philosophy may give them inspiration. So graduates of Bethune-Cookman University and non-graduates have persistently invested social capital and activism within Black communities through various types of organized membership as a result of Dr. Bethune's leadership. This was my praxis in South Africa and is presently my praxis. Of the 9 tenets of her last will and testament, I highlight this one, number 9, practice intentionally. I practice it intentionally with undergraduate students at University of Northwest, the historically Black university, later reconstructed as Northwest University, Mahikeng. So during both my Fulbright lived experiences, I took personal responsibility for investing in young people, particularly my students. My teaching goals, approaches, and texts with highlighted intentionality situated my teaching in a socially just, humanistic, and equitable frame, which includes an Ubuntu perspective and counters colonial ideologies. So as a Lilly teaching Fulbright, a Lilly teaching fellowship, after receiving tutelage, I renovated my teaching style. Real learning became my modus operandi within classroom context. Engaging students in active and cooperative learning function as one means of inculcating, quote unquote, real learning. No longer would I commit solely to unilateral teaching styles where students take in information passively through memorization and regurgitation. On the contrary, students needed to mount the learning bicycle, balance themselves, and start pedaling. In one undergraduate sociolinguistic course that I will never forget, I utilized active and cooperative learning. The students, according to their accounts, were enmeshed in unilateral modes of learning. My approach was a new challenge for them, yet we worked through it progressively, co-constructing the learning. First, they shared the syllabus was overwhelming. They encountered problems, remaining on target with readings and assignments. I deleted a number of readings and assignments. Reading, writing, and thinking critically became our modus operandi. I positioned the intersection of critical reading, writing, and thinking as pivotal for academic learning, aligning with practices many academicians use already. Students had to go beyond passively highlighting the reading materials, yet delve into analyzing texts. Take notes in the margins, summarize the paragraphs, ask questions, including asking the authors questions, disagreeing with positions respectfully. I model my expectation slideshows that appeal to their heart, substantive discussions couched in textual evidence, active engagement and participation in discussions, sharing personalized experiences, asking questions, deconstructing implications. And students rose to the challenge. They led class sessions, they distributed handouts of their deconstructions of content, engaged their peers in conversations, challenged each other. They mounted that learning bicycle. They balanced themselves. They started pedaling and they took off. I saw empowered students emerge during that course. They made active investments in their learning and shared their enthusiasm and appreciation for such an approach, which they eagerly wanted to enact in other course contexts. I know Dr. Bethune continually looks down from heaven upon her Black roses, as she referred to BCU students. I know she is at peace and rest, fully cognizant that her legacy continues to live on, especially internationally, in the seminal space of the origins of humankind. My second home, South Africa. Amandla.
Michael, I don't know where the PowerPoint is. Okay. Thank you very much, Denise.
Right down there.
On the thumb drive there?
No, you mean your PowerPoint? Or-
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's that one right there. Right? That
All
one?
right. Okay, there. I guess that's
Is that your info?
okay. Well, thank you. At my spouse's request, we're going to let her go last since she deals with some summaries of all this.
Dave, do you have two different PowerPoints?
No, I
No,
just
just
have
this
Gotcha.
just
continuation.
one.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the activism of our faculty and then of our students. Because what happened in the activism of FSU was not only the explosion of projects and partnerships abroad with our African colleagues, but also an increasing exchange with Africa. For instance, by 2005, 306 Nigerians have advanced degrees from Michigan State University as part of our building of Nigerian capacity to operate their own university. Okay. Okay, sorry. So in this first stage of solidarity, I think, the looking at the National Security Memorandum 39 of 1969, where Henry Kissinger announced that the whites are here to stay in Southern Africa, including in the Portuguese territories and Rhodesia. Excuse me. The faculty voted to embargo exchange with South Africa, and unlike a number of American universities that increased their exchanges with South Africa, again, the American presence there, the faculty at MSU voted to, and the center voted to embargo South Africa. The second faculty action was realizing that the CIA was so active in Africa in trying to undercut African socialist regimes and leaders. There was a decision to boycott military and intelligence funds for African studies. The Defense Intelligence Agency actually invited in the directors of UCLA, Boston University, Indiana University, and MSU to say, we can really offer you a lot of money for an annual report on things in Africa. So he said, what kind of report? They said, well, you can decide that yourself, what you want. But they were really trying to offer us close to $500,000 a year, which was way beyond our Title VI budgets at that time, if we would simply join the club. And they said, you can even use that to train African students if you want to. But we decided that given what the CIA was doing all across Africa at that time, would not do it. And so the center, with only one abstention, voted to boycott military and intelligence funds, including the National Security Education Program fellowships that were being touted by DIA. That then led to our trying to go beyond those 4 universities and to invite in all Title VI universities to join in that boycott. And after some discussion, it actually happened. And then the African Studies Association joined that as its policy, and the Association of African Studies program. Interestingly, the African Language Association, which was in many ways much more dependent upon security funding, did not join in that boycott. The faculty also, of course, pressed for honorary degrees for Nelson Mandela, Bishop Tutu, and Ahmed Kathrada. The first time the center proposed Nelson Mandela's honorary doctorate, it was turned down because the head of the MSU honorary degree committee said that he was a member of a terrorist organization as designated by the United States, and so Michigan State could not honor a terrorist as such. Also for Bishop Tutu and Ahmed Kathrada. And then the other thing that Denise and Bill and others represent is a range of partnerships with Africans after the end of Rhodesian white rule, the Portuguese rule in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. and in South Africa. And those post-apartheid agreements were some of the most important ones. Bill Derman mentioned with his picture here is his being one of the co-founders of the Southern Africa Liberation Committee with Carol Thompson and several other colleagues there. And the founding of SALC really was a start of the really anti-apartheid work, starting first in '77 with going to the City Council of East Lansing, which actually did vote and passed its regulation prohibiting municipal contracts with suppliers who operated in South Africa. In spite of that vote, as you might suspect, a lot of GMC and Chevy police cars were actually purchased by the city. But it was a start of the kind of boycott actions. The most interesting one that Liz and Bill have both referred to is the McGough Off project. McGough was a publisher who owned more than 25 newspapers in Michigan, who, by the way, who fired those editors of those papers who congratulated Jimmy Carter on his election. McGough was of the far right, and we only discovered, thanks to South Africa's willing to publish their dismay with him, that he actually had received more than $30 million to purchase the Washington Times, which sorry, it was the Times of the Star.
I think it was the Times. Yeah.
It was the Times at that time, to become a voice for South Africa in Washington, D.C., as opposed to the Washington Post there. He, unfortunately for John, they bundled the newspaper with a television station at the last minute to sell, and he didn't have quite enough money from the South Africans to actually make the purchase. So he, having failed in that, he took the money, purchased a yacht and some property in Florida, and also was able to purchase the Sacramento Union as a voice for South African propaganda. He became, having been at one time a senior person in MSU's Alumni Association, John gave $1 million to MSU to have the Passant Theater renamed the McGough Theater. And as Liz remember, there are many demonstrations from the Southern Africa Liberation Committee, students and faculty, which bugged a lot of Wharton attendees. The university decided that the costs were too high. And actually, one of the presidents of MSU took the $1 million back to McGough and apologized that they were going to need to rescind the action that they had. That was celebrated by SALC with two of its most active members. One on the left there,
right.
Professor Frank Beeman, MSU's tennis coach,
right.
Who actually lobbied MSU presidents against apartheid issues on the tennis court where he was their tennis partner. And there with him, his wife, Pat, as they're pointing to the celebration of the McGough being off the Martin Center. And so SALC had a lot of mobilizing on campus with buttons and T-shirts and the like. And all this led to, in the end, in March 1978, when Aubrey Radcliffe, a PhD from MSU College of Education and a teacher in a Lansing school, member of the Board of Trustees, made the motion for MSU to divest from all apartheid investments. And so it actually occurred to the first divestment of any university to actually be completed in the United States, not the first one to be started, but completed. And ironically, an investment that actually was positive. Having said that MSU would fail to get the proceeds that they needed from their investments if they divested. In fact, the switch from large cap South African-based stocks and the companies in South Africa to small cap stocks timed the market perfectly. and NSU made a profit. That was followed by many other universities, and I think the MSU action actually paid off. It seems to me that this is a reference to how the activism paid off of the Southern Africa Liberation Committee and others. The faculty went on to actually hold a number of national conferences to try to get other universities to join us in not taking the students which are nominated by the South African Department of Education as our graduate students, but but to take refugee students and students who had been in the camps of the ANC and ZAPU and ZANU and the MPLA in Angola, EAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. So it was a rich history that built in many ways, I think, on the world, the development in the world of the United Nations, the explosion of African countries in 1960 and beyond in independence, and out of the Cold War dynamic that actually was set aside as the National Defense Education Act was changed in 1965 to the Higher Education, International Higher Education Act, which, by the way, I suspect is one of the chief reasons that the writers of the 2025 document want to see the Department of Education eliminated, because they see these Title VI centers as sources of breeding leftists and the like. And it is not just the other programs of the because Campus Watch, a right-wing group to identify professors who are too liberal for their taste, including some of us here at MSU as well, has long wanted to get rid of the Title VI programs, especially the Africanist and the Middle East programs, which they both see as traitors to the true American cause. So it's a lot to be proud of, having been, as we were told quietly by one of the administrators of the Title VI program in Washington, that the center, with its 32 African languages, with its production of more PhDs than any other African center or university in the United States for several decades, actually in the national rankings in the competitions, was ranked #1. And that, of course, all of this activity led to a cadre of graduate students who chose Michigan State over other places because they realized that the faculty here were activists for progressive causes for the future of Africa and the like. So with that, let me just say that no one is talking about the other thing that I hope someone will mention to our president, that the MSU, in a survey 5 years ago, using 30 measures of international activity, number of Fulbrights, languages, PhDs, international centers, Title VI programs, and the like, was ranked 7th nationally in terms of internationalization, ahead of all of the Big Ten universities, as well as Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, and Princeton and others. Something to be proud of, which MSU can build on, which I think builds on the strength of this African program, which was built on its faculty who were activists bringing home the experience of partnerships with their open and non-materialist African partners in Africa, who were with whom they had served and enjoyed their time there. Thank you. I neglected to introduce someone who I know fairly well here, Christine Root, who served as the Associate Director of the Washington Office on Africa for a decade in the 1970s, She also is active in local organizations there, such as the DC Bank Campaign and DC Data.
Wiley, by a man in New York named Richard Knight, who was a former staff person at the American Committee on Africa. Then it came to MSU and was sponsored by the African Studies Center, and then developed this connection with Matrix when Dave suggested that what Richard was thinking of was just collecting physical archives. Dave said, well, this needs a digital component. So that developed. And then the other two projects, which I'm just going to mention at the end, but it's so important because they really complement each other for researchers and teaching and inspiration for activism. And that is the Community Video Education Trust, which was a video education group in Cape Town that collected video footage that they taught community members to make. And so there's a tremendous amount of raw footage. It's not finished films, very, very valuable, documenting anti-apartheid activity in South Africa. And then the third one is an educational resource called South Africa Overcoming Apartheid, Building Democracy, which incorporated a number of resources to, that are documentary in nature. So how do I get to the slideshow version?
I think you're in it. I think you're in it.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. I always forget that you see.
Sorry.
So I click here. Okay, great. So starting with the African Activist Archive, I should say digital projects, but involving people in the United States and in South Africa are complicated. Anybody who's done any work on that would attest to that. Who should control them? Where should they be produced? And if you don't take that seriously, you're not going to be, you won't get anywhere. You will grind out. So the two projects that I will mention at the end, Overcoming Apartheid and the Community Video Education Trust, were projects that involved partnership agreements, really, developed partnerships with South African organizations. The African Activist Archive is a different situation because this is documenting activism in the United States. So the feeling was we have a responsibility to document our activist work. So that one is a US, it really was taken on by US activists. So there are 14,300 items now in the digital archive on the African Activist Archive that are available to anyone for free. And you can see that there are many media types. There's material from about 570 organizations from 40 states and the District of Columbia. I never would have expected that we would have 14,000 items. I never would have expected they would be from 570 organizations. Now, some of those organizations, we have one item that we sort of bumped into in a file of other things. Other organizations, we have a very, very significant number. The other thing I never would have expected is that we cooperated with more than 225 individuals to locate and have the opportunity to scan documentary information. All of the materials included are items created by activist organizations. That's the concept of this project. It does not have scholarship by individuals on this subject because that's a whole other piece of work. It's a resource for scholars and teachers and contemporary activists. Very quickly, there's three components: the digital archive, and the browse search and advanced search is only of the digital archive. Then there are, and was updated maybe 3 years ago with very nice system of filters. So you can start with searching and browsing and then narrow in. The other components are a list of physical archives. So people looking for physical archives can get access to them here. And then there's something called related sites, which is other sites that have nothing to do with us that also have archival material on a similar, on a related subject. So you can you can browse for a US organization and find what physical archives exist about that organization and items in the digital archive on this website. And I just wanted to mention that it includes some very valuable video material from South Africa Now, which was a Sunday morning sort of TV magazine that has just some wonderful cultural and political video material. And this is just an example of, the description of individual items. Scanning an item and putting it online is totally useless if it doesn't have information about it that can then be searched. So it includes, as I say, material by activist organizations, starting in the 1950s. And I'm not going to go through these, individually, although I'll make a couple of points about it. One of the categories of activism is student and campus activism. We found that it's difficult to collect this material because a lot of students move several times soon after college and don't think of themselves as archivists.
Right.
And don't keep a lot of stuff. So it was actually hard to find, but we do have some things from the 60s and the 70s here. This is a piece on the MSU divestment campaign next to that red button, and the 80s. One of the things I like about this leaflet is it's a reminder that almost all of these things were created physically, and we scanned them to make them digital. So there's a lot of handwritten work on these leaflets. So, somebody created these images. They didn't go to Getty or Shutterstock. Yeah, no Shutterstock. So, somebody did a nice piece of work here. We've talked about shanties in the 1980s. They were all over the country. Sometimes there was encounters with police. Another category of work that's documented here is bank campaigns. This is just an indication of the 14 states from which we have documented bank campaigns, starting in the 60s in New York City. This is California and Chicago. This is, to me, another example of some very interesting artwork that was created by a human being for this purpose and this purpose only, showing that Continental Bank, showing a connection, an organic connection between Continental Bank and South Africa in an artistic way. There were many of these Stop Banking on Racism that were modeled on withdrawal slips, which I guess people today may not know even what a withdrawal slip is, but they were politicized withdrawal slips. Another important thing about the bank campaign, as you can see this red button, it says Red Line South Africa, not New York. This was a campaign, in many cities that explicitly connected international solidarity with the anti-racist struggle in South Africa, to which, because banks were supporting the white regime or the economy in the white ruled country, connected that with the bank's redlining of refusing to make loans in African-American sections of cities. It really created, and people did research on this and really thought about it and included it in the educational brochures. So this went through the 80s. Then there's also documentation about city and state divestment legislative campaigns. We haven't really spent much time talking about the ones in Michigan, but they're documented on the website. And then there were corporate boycotts also. One of the things I enjoy about this archive is you can see different political philosophies and tactics on the same issues. And this is an example of a stockholder resolution on Angola, a demonstration outside the stockholder meeting, and these other folks are activists who have bought 1 or 2 shares in Gulf so that they could go inside to do activism inside. You might think these are such different tactics. These people all must be, disparate.
Yeah.
They knew each other. They were coordinated often.
Right.
There were some, sometimes things were done separately and not coordinated, but by and large, there was a lot of coordination. Here again, also on Angola, very different sets of politics. The poster being pointed to here, you can see an African woman holding a child with a gun slung over her shoulder. And the writing up at the top of the poster that's not legible because of size says, boycott, there are but 2 sides in a war. She fights on the side of African freedom. Gulf finances the other. A very clear anti-imperialist liberation support ideology in this poster. And then below, there was another Gulf boycott effort organized out of Dayton, Ohio, that took the thrust of the US came from a revolution. So people with a revolutionary history should support a revolution in Angola. Different set of politics, the same political campaign. We okay? Great, thank you. And then there was explicit work of liberation support, liberation movement support. Bill mentioned the importance of the film A Luta Continua. It is on the African Activist Archive. That was not early on. This was probably after we've been going for 15 years. So that's the end of this section on the African Activist Archive. Dave and I both used this poster in the center, which was it has the image of buttons from the different campaigns that Salk did over the years. So it's a lovely little historical object itself. So I just wanted to mention Overcoming Apartheid, which was a curriculum resource funded by NEH. It was aimed mostly at high school students, although it's been used in undergraduate classrooms as well. The content was written by Peter Lim and then edited by Peter Alegi, of chronological units. And then there were a number of essays written by different people. For example, there's one on Bantu education that was very widely used. But there were many of them. And this also, was based on, if you're trying to educate students, you need to provide them with primary material for them to think about themselves. So what we did was to, actually, I think I probably can't go backwards.
You can on this. You can on this here.
Okay. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that's important about this project is that there were 45 interviews. About 40 of them were done specifically for this project, and then a few were incorporated from other people. So this was new material created for this project. These are interviews with, almost all of them are South Africans. There are few internationalists in the mix, and there were many, many projects at that time about interviewing people involved in the struggle. And they're all valuable, but many of them didn't actually get online. It's actually, you can't necessarily get to things easily. So this was done sort of opportunistically. Some of them were done at a conference. Some of them were done over time. Some of them were with parliamentarians, members of the parliament early on. But this is a place where you can access the entire interview and thematic segments. And then we also created 25 pages on particular topics, pages of the web pages with not only segments of interviews, but also some posters, some photographs, which came from SAHA, the South African History Archive in South Africa, and the South African National Archive. We got agreements to use limited numbers of materials to incorporate here. And then the third that I want to mention is the Community Video Education Trust. CAVET had all these videos in, classic situation. They were on shelves, they were dusty, there was no control of, the temperature or humidity. And they really wanted to preserve these things. And this project had, a project where all of it was digitized in Cape Town by people working with CAVET. And there are about 100, I think, videos of organizing in South Africa during the period of the late 80s, mostly mid to late 80s, and also after Mandela was released. People coming back from exile, their fascinating interviews and press conferences. There's a training session for what to do if the police knock on your door. I'm going back in time a little bit. And just a whole variety of documenting things that they wanted to save, people needed to learn. So the African Activist Archive of Activism in the US and CAVET, it's mostly Cape Town. It's not entirely Cape Town. So it's hard. I'm not pretending it documents everything that happened inside South Africa, but they are a wonderful combination of materials. So you can, find them on different topics, and then that's the end.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. So, any questions?
I think there's some online.
Agenda?
Maybe. Yeah.
Oh, we used a lot of time, didn't we?
Okay. Well, I have one about who funded, how is this funded, this video,
Interesting.
this project?
Interesting. The two that involved partnerships with people in South Africa
Mhm.
were funded by one of them NEH and another US Department of Education, a program that doesn't exist anymore, but was part of the Title VI program at the time. The African Activist Archive was heavily funded by individual donations over a 20-year period. It really is an activist created project, and its funding represents that as well. It's former activists who cared about it. We also got one Ford Foundation grant for, I think, $90,000. And a small family foundation, the Samuel Rubin Foundation, which had supported the American Committee on Africa for many years, gave usually $5,000 a year to the African Activist Archive Project. In the 2018 recession, there was a year we got nothing. Then the next year we got $1,500, and then it went back to $5,000. Their generosity has been extraordinary, and the program officers have been helpful in programmatic ways too. They said, how are you going to make sure that this will stay online? What are you going to do about making sure that the digital files, the higher resolution digital files than the ones that are posted online, are kept? And who's going to be able to access them when you get requests to use them in other ways at museum exhibits or for books or for and these are very difficult questions, and they are the right questions. So that's the answer about the funding.
See, there's somebody raised their hand online. Can you see it?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. This is, oh, you've got the control? Good.
No, I have to.
No, that's
You
not.
can unmute Solomon.
Hello.
Great.
Good evening, Ugandan time. Solomon Ochwoburu, Kampala. I'm a lecturer in a university, lecturer of history, and a researcher in the same area. I have been following your presentation. Well done. But I have detected a pattern. When young Africans sense social injustice, marginalization of the minority and the rest, they usually rise up and advocate for freedom and liberty. We see examples in personalities such as Kwame Nkrumah, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Sylvester Williams, George Padmore. We come to Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Milton Obote, and the rest. But sometimes when these very people grow into old age, they turn around and support the oppressors. What happens? Is it mental captivity or the factor of aging? Thank you. Solomon Ochwoburu, Kampala.
Did you hear that?
Yes.
No, I couldn't
Okay.
hear.
Do you want to respond to that, Bill? You mentioned it. Dave couldn't hear it,
Yes,
so that's
kindly
why
respond.
I'm speaking.
There's not a single answer. And there are tendencies to become paranoid when you become a leader. So I was doing research in Guinea when Sekou Touré just announced that Kwame Nkrumah was now vice president of Guinea with no consultation, with no acceptance. It's an act of arbitrary power. There's a second dimension, which is a bit different, which is the phrase, now it's our time to eat. And then that has to do with what do you do with the resources now available when you are high up in state power. And one could think of, for example, Jacob Zuma as being a person who is like that. Then it becomes more complicated in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe himself was not particularly corrupt, but the people around him were. And then you have to exercise power in a different way over your longtime supporters. So I think it's a wonderful question, but there are diverse answers for each place and the historical circumstances. And so you have to answer for yourself, for Uganda, and how that power is working and who is enriching themselves.
I guess I would just add very briefly that it seems that one of the things that happens is that African leaders are surrounded by impossible dilemmas. The demands for health, especially for health, for education, for decent pay for jobs, is all undercut by the bleeding away of profits from the mining operations, especially from the failure to pay taxes by corporations in those countries. And I have often wondered why or how is it possible that African leaders can remain optimistic and positive and moving forward when they're surfaced by so many demands from so many sources, some of those demands accompanied with dashes with graft to turn them aside. So I think the problem of African leaders is just immense. And it's not surprising that they can become disillusioned, bitter, perhaps even self-serving. Well, it's my turn to have something amidst all this wealth. So I think a lot of the blame has to do with the way Africa and its economies are situated in the world economy and the way that Africa is dealt with in terms of its health needs. Some of you may know that less than half of the health workers in Africa were actually fully vaccinated against COVID when they were working with it. While over here down in Kalamazoo, the CEO of Pfizer is earning $24 million a year salary, plus is a billionaire now, one of the 9 billionaires created by the pharmaceutical industry during the COVID time. And the Moderna CEO, he only earns $17 million a year, but also is already with his stock options a billionaire. So these inequalities that have been accepted and that are now being accentuated in our country are just meant for a terrible dilemma for African leaders who come with optimism that they'll be able to deal with the needs of their country and to be positive, but in the end are undercut by all these external forces.
There's a question here.
Yes, thank you. My name is Chenjere. I'm African Studies Librarian. To what extent does the panel think that capitalism plays a role in the maintaining economic social inequalities?
That seems 100%. I mean, that's really what apartheid was about. It's what racism in the States was about, was maintaining a workforce that would accept, smaller wages. And I mean, it's almost always been about that. And that's why there's been such a defense of it, such a vociferous defense of whatever status other people have, is that they're maintaining a capitalist advantage, right? A system that works. And then it becomes invisible. That's part of the problem.
I'm saying even in today's world, sometimes it seems we are going backwards again, because you see, when these African leaders come into office, sometimes you play around with socialism and all these other forms of ideologies, and then you don't get investments. So you are pushed to the real capitalist wealth. And who dictates that? The monopolist white capital. Even today, when we look at what is obtaining on the ground, this is why young Africans become disillusioned with their leaders. Yeah, because the capitalists want to maintain a small group an elitist, or they simply create an elitist, black elitist group that becomes rich, who things are like with them, and then to maintain their economic power and leverage. Otherwise, I've not seen an African country growing in the way everybody kind of is uplifted at the same time. The majority of the people continue to struggle. Sometimes the inequalities become even more acute.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at South Africa now, one of the reasons why now ANC does not have the majority is because the economy has remained in the hands of those who get it. If you look at Namibia, when they got independence in 1990, the inequality ratio was 95 to 5%. 5% of the population owned 95% of the wealth. After 20, 25 years, it moved to 90 versus 10%. It hardly moves around that. Zimbabwe, at some point, we thought now we are moving upwards and some middle class kind of formation, then downward spiral again. And I see that all over again when they go to Nigeria, you go to Kenya, we're faced with the same kind of challenge.
I would just
It's
add
very
you
interesting.
said that when I was working in Kenya on the fisheries on Lake Victoria.
Well, to just respect, I'm sorry, people's time, if you're free and want to stay, that's fine. Otherwise, we understand that you have to go.
Okay.
Okay, so good.
Okay, well, let me thank especially Denise, Chris, Liz, for joining us today in this discussion. We need triple the time. So once again, all the way in Norway, Bill, thanks for joining us and all the.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Thanks for updating me on several dimensions, and it sounds like I left out the Department of Education from my concerns about shredding
Yes, right.
things that are good.
Yep.
And I imagine that the Title
There'll be
VI
something
centers-
tomorrow too.
The Title VI centers
Last
will
note,
defend
as I was about to
themselves.
say, the Kenyans told me, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
The Kenyans told me, remember our proverb, when one sets a portion for oneself, usually it's not too small. And it was, speaking of capitalism in Kenya.
Just a quick aside, I thank you all, but Liz, I want to underline one thing that you raised that's really important, which is it is so hard in the midst of despair to believe that one cannot make a difference.
Right.
But when you focus on what is within your span of either control and frankly within your gaze.
Right.
And I think that you talked about that quite well. I think that it's very important that young people, especially through Chris's work and other people's work, be able to understand what, my wife Ann loves the remark that has been made many times about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I think that the idea of acting locally,
right,
and especially looking where the levers,
right,
as Archimedes said long ago, let me know where to put the point and how long the stick and where the fulcrum is, and I could move the world. And indeed, I think that what people were able to do here at MSU is extremely important historically, but it's extremely important contemporarily for people to be able to both take hope from it,
yes,
and to take strong examples.
I think that's actually a really good point to make, is that it was one of our, there haven't been that many, one of our success stories, and we were a little bitty corner of a movement that you can see from Chris's documents, we're all over the country. And we really have to take some lessons fast, because there's a lot of work every day. Trump dumps another job on our books. I don't know how we're gonna do it.
Also, during that period, since I was here with you at that period.
Yes.
By the way, as a student. Remember the stopping of the Iranian film project?
Yes,
Same time
Right.
frame,
right.
and also that emphasis on.
What we were doing locally.
That's
Right, yeah, exactly. That's very, it's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's,
All right,
it's
thank you.
very enlightening. And then we don't want to lose this opportunity. I know that these presentations we're gonna try to use as well, but we are looking to document these. So we look at, so we will reach out to you, the things that you left out, and hopefully, Chris, maybe we can, the Tabo Making Foundation are looking to build a museum there too. So this work will complement that. They express interest when they visit here. They're amazing resource that we have.
Great.
So
Thank
thank you very much.